This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Welcome to Uncorking a Story, the podcast that introduces you to the rich world of storytellers who share their personal journeys, creative processes, and the stories behind their stories, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Mike Carlon, and I'm thrilled to be part of your writing journey. If you're an aspiring writer, a literary enthusiast, or simply someone who believes in the transformative power of words, you've come to the right place. Every week, we'll pop the cork on the world of successful storytellers and give you a healthy pour of inspiration, insight, and empowerment. My mission is to help writers like you realize your full potential through the transformative and therapeutic power of writing. Whether you're just starting your literary voyage or looking to refine your craft, I'm here to provide you with the knowledge, inspiration, and encouragement you need to embark on your own storytelling adventure. So, are you ready to uncork your story and let your creativity flow? Uncorking a Story is about to begin. Sit back, relax, and let the transformative magic of storytelling whisk you away. Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Adoptee Lisa Ann is the host of Wandering Tree podcast, connecting with her guests on thought-provoking discussions focused on the adoption journey and spoken with each person's unique perspectives. Guests show the resilience, personal growth, and the power of positivity. Known for her emphatic interview style, insightful questions, and the ability to authentically connect with her guests, Lisa Ann creates a welcoming space for constructive discussions on the lived experiences of adoption. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Lisa Ann.
Why, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. And Lisa Ann, I'm going to ask you the question I ask all my guests in the beginning, which is, where does your story begin?
My story begins as an adoptee, and that means it starts at birth and kind of goes forward from there. My journey is important to me and to share it out with others so that there is a change in some narrative around the concepts of adoptees. So I want to again thank you for allowing me to come on the show to talk about, that lived experience and dive in a little bit differently than maybe what your listeners are used to from a book perspective. As you stated, I am a podcaster and I have some deep roots in the adoptee community, and I have a lot of other co-podcasters in our space that are really working hard to change the perspective of adoption. And there are some facets to that are interesting and important, but there's a groundswell going on, and I want to be part of the change management of that. And I also want to help just one person. So if I backtrack for a moment in my own story and say, where's the beginning? Well, the beginning is at life and birth and relinquishment. The podcasting component beginning has been within the last 5 years. I'm coming on 5 years, and having an advocacy and wanting to help change kind of perception and help others is the second beginning.
All right. Well, let's get, if you don't mind, let's go back to your beginning. When did you know that you were adopted? Was this a family secret, or were your adopted parents upfront with you from an early age?
My adoptive parents chose to inform me that I was adopted right before I went into kindergarten. And the reason they chose that moment in time, it really centered around two other adoptees in our community. We were a very small community, and it was going to be obvious that some of us were adopted. And that set of parents must have made the decision together to say, oh, these three children are going to be in class together. Maybe they'll have some camaraderie or some, additional linkage, which is really interesting because we knew of each other prior to going into kindergarten. We lived houses away from each other and just didn't have that fact. So it was really going into kindergarten. That was their decision to peel back the onion, so to speak.
Do you remember how you felt at the time? Was it did you feel one way or another about it, or was it just like a new fact you learned?
So, in retrospect, it feels like it was a new fact. And looking at it differently and through multiple other lenses, what I can tell you is that it probably changed who I started to become. There were words that were used many, many times after that. You were chosen, you're special, your mother loved you so much, she gave you away, all of those types of narratives. And so, as you're growing and you're in that really formative stage of relationship building, that's kind of back in your mind and you're trying to figure out how to navigate that, and you most likely don't have the tools to do so. So how did I feel? I felt special. I also was on one side of my adoptee family the only girl, and so then that added another layer of, well, you're the only girl, you're the only niece, you're the only granddaughter. It's a lot to kind of work through as a child.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. We were talking before I hit the record button, and you were mentioning how you were surprised that that I said yes to the interview because I typically have authors on here. My older brother was adopted, and this was a family secret, not to him, but to the other kids in the family. So my older brother is 9 years older than me. He My parents, struggled having kids, and this is going back to the mid '60s. So he was born in '65, and a year and a half, 2 years later, my sister comes around. They have her, the biological way. I don't like the old fashioned way. And then my twin brother and I were born in the mid '70s, and we were the big surprise, right? We're the surprise of the family. But I didn't know my brother was adopted until I was probably about 18 years old, and we were at a family. We were down in Florida, so that's where my parents were living at the time, and my brother was living down there too. We were hanging out with some extended family, and Auntie Joan, one of these aunts who's not really an aunt, but we call her an aunt, right? This like German woman was like, "Oh, Michael, you're so special." I'm like, "Well, what makes me so special?" And she said, "Well, you're the firstborn male of the family." And I'm looking around the room like, Greg, like Greg is 9 years older than me. Like what? And I asked him like, "Well, did you forget about Greg?" And she's like, "Oh," and then she like plays it off. And then we're going somewhere in the car later that night, and that's when my mother like turns to me and my brother Jim and says, "Oh, we have something to tell you." And that's when she says, we struggled having a family early on, so we adopted Gregory. And it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, not because I felt he was any less my brother, but just because of the secrecy of the whole thing. And to put a cherry on top of this story, my twin brother turns to me and he says, "I've known this for years." And I'm like, "How the hell did you know?" He's like, "Oh yeah, my sister told us. Yeah, Mia told me." I'm like, "Well, why do people keep things from me?" I'm like, but that's so when I heard your story, and then there's actually his story gets, even more interesting later on, but I'm going to pause just to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, that's the interesting thing about adoptees and adoption in general. So that tells me that your brother was part of what we call the baby scoop era, which had a lot of secrecy around that, typically closed adoptions. I'm an American, right? Domestic, we call it domestic closed adoption. And you either know or you don't know. And then family members either know or they don't know. And when it starts peeling back another layer of my, metaphor for an onion, it is just astounding how people find out, how they feel about it when they find out, and then what does change in terms of the family dynamics. What's really interesting making this story and our interview like string theory oriented. I am the oldest, I'm the adoptee, and I am the only adoptee. And I have two biological brothers. And for very similar reasons, I was adopted. My parents were told they would never be able to have their own biological children. And 4 years after, me into the family through adoption, surprise, my mom's pregnant. She has a child. My middle brother And she's told it'll never happen again. Another 4 years later, she has another child. She has very difficult pregnancies. And they're like, we have no idea. We can't explain to you. These are just miracle babies. And so now we have, chosen and special and miracle babies in the same family. And that's a lot of vying for attention. And we have a whole lot of other family dynamics. But yeah, it's just a really interesting piece to be part of a family where it's a mix of adoption and biological children and how they're raised or what they know. And it just really, it's so interesting. But I love what you've said. And it helps when other adoptees hear this too, which was it didn't change how you felt about your brother. And that's really important because for, a few adoptees in our space, sometimes it does change the story, does change the relationship. It may change from the adoptee perspective, or it may change from the other family member perspective. It's really just a flip of the coin sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, really, my older brother was one of my best friends. I use past tense because he passed away last summer.
Oh, condolences.
Yeah, thank you. But oh god, I'm getting choked up, and I didn't expect to do that.
It
Um,
happens. It happens.
but it's
Oh,
like I think about, and I know this conversation should be about you, and I'm totally making it about me. But my parents have an interesting backstory to how Greg came into their lives, because they were on a list, an adoption list for years, um, domestic adoption, and they were like next up on the list with with an agency, probably in Westchester County, New York, where they were living, and they were my father. He's he's a funny guy. He would find any way to make a buck. So he was hired by somebody to drive a car from New York to California, and he was paid to do this. So he and my mom went on this trip. On this trip, they're coming back from California by train through Canada, which I didn't even know was possible. But, this is how the story goes. My mother finds out she's pregnant on that trip. So, per the rules of the agency, she has to call and let them know, and, loses her spot in line because she's having a baby. Well, on the way back, she miscarries. So now no longer pregnant, back of the list, right? Back of the line, if you will, with this agency. But had that not happened, Greg would never have come into our lives. It would have been somebody else. So there was some, I believe, and I get to a spiritual side of things, not necessarily religious, but I'm open to possibilities here. Um, but this was meant to be, like, these events happen for a reason, and then Greg comes into our lives. So we're my parents' life, and he's the one who starts everything off. So anyway, I don't know why I feel like the need to divulge all these family tales here, but I
no,
figured you'd
it's
be a good
okay.
person to talk to.
Yeah, that's what happens and as well. It's important to be comfortable in sharing those. That's why we're talking. That's why I wanted to be on your show to get more exposure for adoptees and adoption so that people are more comfortable sharing those stories. You have a very positive view of that, and it's okay to have a positive view. We have both sides of the kind of if you were to think of this like a pendulum, you can have a really bad experience as an adoptee and you can have some really good experiences as an adoptee. And sometimes we get really wrapped up in how our life was or how it could have been. And that's natural too. So when you're talking about the impact that your brother has had on your family and you speak so highly and it's positive and it choked you up, there's probably someone out there going, oh boy, we had this crazy child, which is a narrative that we all know. We know that, really historically, there have been two consistent ways that I would say Hollywood and TV represent adoptees. One is it's this really great, 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 super thing. You'll hear many of my colleagues and friends in the community call it rainbows and unicorns. And then you'll also hear, how it was the worst thing ever and it was the worst child. And they did all these terrible things to this family that was just trying to help them out. And there's some of both of those, and then there's a lot in the middle. For myself, I would tell you it's a lot in the middle. And I went on the search to find my biological family because there was an aspect of my story where I did fantasize about what my real mother was, right? Or my biological mother and father. My fantasy was two kids graduating high school, someone got pregnant, they decided to go ahead and give the baby up for adoption, hence me, so I could have a better life and they could go and live their lives. And one day, we'd be united and maybe I'd knock on the door and this woman, she'd be, so beautiful and everything else. And she'd open the door and we'd fall into each other's arms. And that was a very, very common fantasy for me. Uh, I utilize that fantasy if I was having a hard time. Now, I would tell you also, though, I've had great times. I had a fantastic maternal adoptee grandmother, and she's my hero. And I would change her for a million other outcomes. She was so wonderful. Along that lines, though, what changed is when I did find my biological family, some of the first indicators that I was going to be secondary rejected came from people who are considered to be my blood relatives. That's really hard to kind of put your mind around because as you're saying he's your brother and you've never changed the way you felt about him, you then meet a stranger who is your brother or your sister or your cousin or your aunt or your uncle or your parent, and they look at you, and when it gets real, because it gets real, you're looking at a stranger and yet genetically you're related. It is such an out of body experience most of the time from my perspective. Every time I met someone new, I would look at them and wonder where their genetic markers were and how many of those that I had. I would look for behaviors, but at the same time, it was like
Yeah.
super awkward.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. And what did that do, if anything, to feelings of abandonment inside you? And I'm not sure if you struggled with that growing up and if this multiplied it kind of later on in life. But I'm always curious to know like how that led to maybe the ability to attach to others later in life.
Oh, mm, I can give you all of that. So, and that's such a great question. I'm gonna talk about me, the person, before I found my biological family. And I do so under the context that I'm not trying to sound conceited. It's just facts. I really have had a really good life. I've had a really good life in the grand scheme of things. Does not mean that we've not had challenges or I've not been faced with challenges. But the piece of that is the mentality. I have had a very successful career. I'm very proud of my achievements. I have been consistently engaged in community outreach and um, advocacy around just general things, the hungry, raising money for cancer, those types of things that people do. I was very active for many, many years in endurance sports and loved all of that. And, I've traveled a good portion of the United States. Actually, I've hit all 50 states and several countries internationally. And I just was going along thinking everything was hunky dory. However, my romantic relationships, I made some really yuck choices, right? Like super yuck choices. And I didn't understand those choices until really just more recently through other means of healing myself. So there's all that. And I share that because you asked, how's knowing and how has being adopted kind of impacted those things. And it drove a high achiever. It drove someone who never could fail for fear. I didn't realize that the need to win or to be on top was out of fear, based out of fear. I chose poor romantic relationships because I was attaching, and then I didn't want to let go for fear of being alone and having been given up. And it just kind of continued. It broke free though when I did meet my biological family, and my world started spinning differently. And at that point, it was some dark days, and it really well, it was a mind boggle. I think I'd use another word, but I'm not
Yeah, no,
sure.
I get you. And we can be explicit if you want to. Uh,
Yeah, it was a mind fuck.
yeah,
Let's just be that's
there we go.
exactly what I
There
want to
we go.
say. Yeah,
Yeah, no,
that's the one. Yeah. It was it was crazy because what I learned about myself and where it flipped the coin again was that I didn't have a mother and a father who were high school sweethearts and who had gone off to college and were successful and waiting for me with open arms. What I learned was that I had a mother and a father, and there's some ambiguity around this, but I've heard it enough times. I believe it to be true that there was sexual assault associated with that.
Mm.
So as soon as that fantasy, the one that I talked about just moments ago, and the reality hit, you're just going, well, maybe that's why people are looking at me weird. Like, maybe that's why they don't want to embrace me. And then I'm paying for the sins of someone else. And that's hard as an adult of any age and in any spot in your life to really come to terms with.
Oh my goodness. So that's, and forget feelings of abandonment. I mean, I don't say forget them, but that's, those are like probably the easier ones to work your way through. Finding out you're the product of you could be the product of assault. That's got to weigh heavy. That's got to weigh heavy on you.
It weighs heavy on you. And then I would also share out, and I have done this publicly. My biological mother has a different, or had, I'm so sorry, she passed as well, mentality capacity than I do. And I immediately started thinking about myself and, am I really like that? Am I not as smart as I thought I was? Am I not as uh, extroverted? Am I introverted? All the things about me that I thought were true started to peel back differently as well. And I started wondering if I was an imposter. So
Mm.
I've had to kind of work through that mentality of imposter syndrome a little bit, shook my entire identity. At who am I? Who am I now that I know this? Does it am I less successful? What about me isn't lovable if these people don't want to spend time with me or they question my validity? One of my favorite stories to share is that I had an experience where I was engaged with a biological relative that it just kept going on and on and on about, why would we want to have a relationship and why would we be connected? And at the end of that particular storyline, I had to come to the conclusion to say, if you don't want one, I'm okay with that. And I'm paraphrasing quite a bit. But just remember, I was a child. I didn't make the decision. I was literally a baby. I didn't make the decision to not be part of the family. Someone made that on my behalf. So here we are as adults, and I found you. And yeah, we're strangers, but we're, biologically considered family. You're either in or you're out.
Yeah. And then there's the this notion of the family you're born into, and then the family you choose. And I assume the family you choose for you is your who you consider your true family.
Yeah. Woo, that one was heavy.
I usually
There
save
is
the
that.
hard ones for the end, but here we are in the middle. So why not just throw it out there?
Let's go for it. Oh, that one is really a difficult one. In the context of this story, I have a biological family. I have a family in which I was placed. I didn't choose that family. And do I have relationships that are very near and dear to me that I would consider family that don't fall into either of those two categories? I do. And I haven't spent as much time thinking about that as maybe I could. But I would say that having that chosen, those deep relationships, they're important to me, and I think they're important to me because I have these other two dynamics going on. And so I don't take close relationships of friendship that are similar to familia lightly. So I do have some chosens, but they're also integrated. Some of them are integrated into my adoptee family and my biological family as well. So that's a hard one. The family is a really hard, probably 7-hour conversation in
Mm,
itself around, the context of being in an adoptee lived experience. Means so many different things.
yeah, no, totally. I'm gonna give you a break for a moment after those hard questions, and just share another part of my brother's story that I found pretty fascinating. So he never, he always considered my our mom and dad to be to his mother and father. So he never really went on uh, a journey to find his biological parents. The only time he was having some health issues, probably in his 30s, and he needed to. Um, I remember, and this wasn't really talked about, but I remember he needed to do some research to see like if these things that he was experiencing was a genetic thing. That's the only time I remember hearing stories about him looking for his birth parents. Now, cut to he's in his 40s. He and I are just kind of thick as thieves, and he calls me one day and he says, "Dude, we have to have dinner." I'm like, "All right, um, let's go." He's like, "I'll treat you to dinner at this local steakhouse." So we go. We're sitting at the bar. And I didn't know what was about to come out of his mouth. I mean, I thought, because he was not married at the time, 9 years older than me, I thought he was going to come out sexually and tell me that he's homosexual or something. No clue, and he wasn't. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but he sits down and he says, "I was in my store." He owned a wine store in Greenwich, Connecticut. He said, "I was in my store, and this woman walks in, and I get a really, really odd feeling, like just this energy in the room changes." He darts into the back room and he asks one of his employees to like take care of this customer. And this customer, it comes in holding a file, and she asks to see my brother. And the manager or whoever it was says he's not available right now. Long story short, this woman is my brother's biological sister, and Greg winds up coming out and talking to her, and they had hired his mother, his birth mother, had hired a private investigator to find him. And yeah, this is years before social media, years before there were over the counter genetic tests and all that stuff. And there was a file. I was in the file because I'm a writer, and I had a lot of like newspaper clippings that she had from me, and that she had a backstory on all of us. And that was his biological sister. And he shared all this with me just to kind of let it out, just to have someone to talk to about it. And I'm like, holy shit. I'm like, that's a heavy story. And that we probably had a second glass of wine after that one. um and he didn't go on to have a big relationship with them. He did meet there were two sisters. He did meet and spend a little bit of time with them, but they never became close. I don't know that he ever met his biological mother. But his story was kind of like your fantasy story. So parents were in high school, fooling around. One gets pregnant, leaves him up for adoption, gives him up for adoption, and then they get married, go on to have a few more kids, and then they wind up getting divorced later on. But yeah, that was his story. And I feel bad that I'm telling it, but he's not around anymore for him to share it or get mad at me for telling the world. So
Yeah, and maybe the point is that you are his voice in this conversation as well. And we talked about the string theory a little bit early on. What I am taking from that is a couple different things that are also advocacy items that I want to share. The whole conversation around adoption and how it is perceived is really what we're trying to change as a community, those that are engaged in becoming public figures through books. And I know you've had a few of the adoptee authors and birth moms on your show. And things that we're trying to do at a legislative level. There are humans. Your brother's story is a great example of that. It's really in that time period, based off of what you said, pre-commercial DNA testing kits. It was very expensive for people to find people, private investigation. It was easier if it was the birth family trying to find the adoptee versus the other way around. Uh, I mentioned earlier your brother maps to baby scoop era closed adoption. That meant no records for us. And that is a state by state initiative. We call it the original birth certificate or the OBC, so that just getting those laws changed has been pretty monumental. It's not even a 50 state win yet. The laws, the regulations or the lack thereof, and the education always side on the positive for the birth parent and do not take the adoptee into consideration. And I think that there is this big, huge gap in understanding we're humans. So when we start out search, I would share that in my experience and those that I've talked to, it always starts with the conversation. I wanted my health information. I think that's what we tell ourselves. I believe that's what we tell ourselves. Oh, I need my health information, but it ends up being so much more than that. And by just human need. So, not only wanting to change the narrative and how people see it and make sure that there's a better reality around the topic where we're not thinking rainbows and unicorns or we're not thinking the absolute evil, that there's the middle ground. Working to change legislative, statutes at the state level and even at the federal level if we ever can get there, so important, so we have equal access to our own records. One of the things we didn't touch on around that is many adoptees have a first name, a first name. So while I go by Adoptee Lisa Ann, that wasn't my birth given name. My birth given name is entirely different. So we already have identity issues and we're not even hardly out of the cradle. Then we go to educating people. I wish that in hindsight, all the things I'm dealing with now as an adult based off of pre-verbal trauma and traumatic events, which is really a very, very deep conversation, could have been addressed when I was 5 and told, when I was going into my preteen years, when I was in my teen years, all of those things, I may have made better relationship choices if there had been ongoing support and education, for those that have adopted and the adoptee themselves. So a little bit more around it, other than all of a sudden you're a human. You could be called, Henry in your case today. If someone hands you over, you're chosen, which is really not the truth. You were just the next available one, and now you have a whole new everything. And getting to that happy place can be many years and decades of work and trials and tribulations. So I really want people to take away from today that while I speak out and others speak out, and you've been speaking out on behalf of your brother, that's what's really important, is to get us to talk about it, because there are humans that might just need a hug.
Yeah, it's so beautifully said. And for those humans who need a hug, virtual or physical, where how can they connect with you, Lisa Ann? How can they, reach out to you, or even just listen to your show and read your content?
Yeah, so my podcast is Wandering Tree. And I am on all of the platforms. And my website is wanderingtree.com. I had to think about it for a minute because it's something we don't say as often anymore. Isn't that odd? We don't really say those things as often anymore. But I also would say just go out and start doing searches on adoptee communities. There's a boatload of Facebook groups if you're interested. I highly advocate for those as well. There are other podcasters. Of course, I'd love for you to listen to my show, but there are some fantastic ones that I also listen to. I encourage us. There are millions of adoptees. There's no way that any one podcaster can hit every one of them. So thank you for asking about that. There are tons of books out there right now. The groundswell is really, building. And they're authors by mothers and adoptees and adoptee mothers, which is really cool. That's a lot of reading to do. And more importantly, just continue to connect with whomever you need to. My last parting comment, if you're an adoptee, you're not alone. And I think that's the most important thing to leave with today.
All right. You are not alone. Lisa Ann, thank you so much for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Yeah. And thank you so much for sharing your brother's story. And again, Wandering Tree.
There we go. So I'll be sure to put all of that in the show notes. So for those of you listening, just look in the show notes. You'll be able to just tap or click, depending on how you navigate, your way to Wandering Tree. Thank you again, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlon uncork a new story.